I never believed in coincidences until I met Tommy Reeves. Now, I'm not so sure about a lot of things I used to take for granted. This whole mess started about 3 years ago when I was working as a freelance photographer for outdoor magazines. I got an assignment to document some of the lesser-known hiking trails in Northern California, specifically around the Mendocino National Forest. The pay wasn't great, but I loved the work. There's something about being alone in the wilderness with just my camera that always cleared my head. Plus, I've been going through a pretty rough divorce at the time, and Sarah had gotten the house, so I was basically living out of my Toyota 4Runner anyway. Camping in the woods beats sleeping in some crappy motel room. I've been working this particular area for about 2 weeks, getting some decent shots of the redwood groves and the creek systems that wound through the valleys. The magazine wanted authentic wilderness photography, which basically meant I had to hike my ass off to get to places where you couldn't see any signs of civilization. No power lines, no trail markers, no garbage left behind by weekend warriors. It was on a Tuesday morning when I first heard the sound. I'd gotten up early to catch the sunrise filtering through the canopy, and I was maybe 4 miles off the main trail, following what looked like an old deer path through a grove of massive redwoods. The air was thick with morning mist, and everything had that cathedral-like quality that makes you want to whisper. I was setting up my tripod when I heard it, this low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, I thought it might be some kind of machinery. Maybe a generator running at a cabin I hadn't noticed, or heavy equipment working on a logging operation somewhere nearby. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it didn't sound mechanical at all. It was more organic, like the sound a massive choir might make if they were all humming the same note, but pitched so low you felt it more than heard it. The weird thing was how it affected the wildlife. I've been seeing plenty of birds and squirrels all morning, but the moment that humming started, everything went dead quiet. Not even the usual rustle of leaves or the distant call of a jay. Just that deep, resonant humming and nothing else. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the sound seemed to shift and move. Sometimes it felt like it was coming from the ground beneath my feet, and other times it seemed to drift down from the canopy above. Eventually, it just faded away, and the normal forest sounds gradually returned. I figured it was probably some kind of acoustic trick, maybe the way sound carried through the particular layout of trees and rocks in that area. I'd read about places where the geography creates weird audio effects. Hell, I've been to the Whispering Gallery at the Capitol building in DC, where you could hear a whisper from across the dome. This was probably something similar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something intentional about it, like it was trying to communicate something. I got my shots that morning and headed back to my campsite, but I kept thinking about that sound. That night, I did some research on my laptop using the campground's spotty Wi-Fi. I searched for everything I could think of: unusual acoustic phenomena, low-frequency sounds in forests, even infrasound and its effects on humans. I found some interesting stuff about how certain frequencies can make people feel uneasy or anxious, but nothing that really matched what I'd experienced. The next morning, I decided to go back to the same area. I told myself it was because I wanted to get some more shots of that particular grove, but honestly, I was curious about whether I'd hear the sound again. I did. This time it lasted longer, maybe 20 minutes, and I was able to narrow down the general direction it was coming from. It seemed to originate from a steep ravine about half a mile deeper into the forest. The humming was definitely stronger when I faced that direction, and fainter when I turned away. I wanted to investigate, but the ravine looked pretty treacherous, and I was alone. Basic wilderness safety meant not taking unnecessary risks when nobody knew exactly where you were. So I made a mental note of the location and headed back to get more shots elsewhere. That's when I met Tommy. I was packing up my gear around noon when I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. I turned around and saw this guy approaching, probably in his early 50s, wearing worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt. He had the kind of weathered face you get from spending most of your life outdoors, with deep lines around his eyes and a gray beard that needed trimming. "Morning," he called out as he got closer. "You're the photographer, right?" I nodded, a little surprised. "Yeah, how'd you know?" He gestured at my camera gear. "Word gets around. Small community up here. I'm Tommy Reeves." He extended a calloused hand, and I shook it. "Jake Morrison. Nice to meet you." "You too. Mind if I ask what brings you to this particular neck of the woods?" "We don't get many professional photographers around here." I explained about the magazine assignment, and Tommy listened with a kind of attention that made me think he was genuinely interested, not just making small talk. You picked a good area, he said when I finished. Some of the prettiest country in Northern California, in my opinion. Of course, it's also some of the strangest. Strange how? Tommy grinned, but there was something in his eyes that made me think he wasn't entirely joking. Oh, you know, old forests like this, they accumulate stories over the years. Native American legends, settler tales, modern urban legends. Most of it's probably bull, but some of it, he shrugged. Some of it makes you wonder. What kind of stories? The usual stuff. Mysterious lights, weird sounds, people seeing things that probably weren't there. He paused and looked at me more carefully. Speaking of weird sounds, you haven't noticed anything unusual while you've been out here, have you? The question caught me off guard, and I'm sure my expression showed it. Tommy's eyes narrowed slightly, like he was reading something in my face. You have heard something, he said. It wasn't a question. I decided to be honest. Yeah, actually. This morning and yesterday. Some kind of low humming sound. Really deep, like it was coming from underground or something. Tommy nodded slowly. How long did it last? 10 minutes the first time, maybe 20 this morning. Why? You know what it is. I've got some theories, he said. But they're probably going to sound pretty crazy to a guy like you. Try me. Tommy looked around like he was making sure we were alone, then stepped closer. There's something down in those ravines, Jake. Something that's been there a lot longer than any of us. The local tribes, the ones who used to live in this area before the loggers came through, they had stories about it. Called it the singer beneath the trees. Singer. That's my rough translation, anyway. The point is, they knew about it. They'd heard the same sound you're hearing now. And they were smart enough to leave it alone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you think it is? Honestly, I don't know. But I've been living in these woods for almost 15 years now, and I've heard that sound dozens of times. Always from the same general area, that big ravine system about half a mile east of here. And I've noticed some patterns. What kind of patterns? Tommy glanced around again, then sat down on a fallen log. Mind if we talk for a few minutes? This isn't the kind of conversation you have standing up. I sat down across from him, my camera bag between us. I'm listening. The sound only happens during certain times of year, Tommy began. Mostly late fall and early winter, but sometimes in the spring too. Never during the summer, never during the peak of winter. And it's always during the day, usually in the morning. I thought about that. Both times I'd heard it had been in the morning, and it was late October now. There's something else, Tommy continued. People go missing in this area. Not a lot, maybe one or two every few years, but it's enough to notice if you're paying attention. And they always disappear during the times when the sound is most active. Missing how? Different ways. Sometimes hikers just never come back. Sometimes hunters head out in the morning, and their truck is still parked at the trailhead 3 days later, but they're nowhere to be found. Search and rescue teams comb through the area, but they never find any trace. No bodies, no equipment, nothing. I felt that chill again, stronger this time. You think there's a connection? I think there's definitely a connection. The question is what kind? Tommy leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Jake, I've lived in a lot of wild places, and I've seen some things that don't fit into neat categories. But this place is different. There's something intelligent down in those ravines. Something that's been watching and waiting for a very long time. Waiting for what? I wish I knew. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the normal sounds of the forest. Birds calling, wind in the trees, the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Everything that had been absent during the humming. Have you ever tried to investigate? I asked. Get closer to the source? Tommy's expression darkened. Once. About 7 years ago. I was younger then, more curious than smart. I followed the sound down into the ravine system, probably 2 or 3 miles deeper than any sane person should go. What did you find? That's the thing. I'm not entirely sure. The deeper I went, the stronger the humming got, but also stranger. It started to sound less like a single tone and more like multiple voices. Harmonies, almost, but not quite. And the woods around me started to change. Change how? Tommy rubbed his beard, like he was trying to figure out how to explain something that didn't make sense. The trees looked wrong. Still redwoods, still the same species, but older somehow, bigger. And there were clearings that shouldn't have been there. Perfectly circular spaces where nothing grew. Not even grass. Natural clearings happen, I said. Soil conditions, drainage issues, lots of reasons. Yeah, that's what I told myself. But these were different. They were too perfect, too deliberate. And in the center of each one, there was this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a small piece of metal, about the size of a quarter, but irregularly shaped. I took it from him and examined it. It was heavier than it looked, and the surface had an odd texture, not quite smooth, but not rough either. There were markings on it that might have been scratches, or might have been some kind of primitive writing. What is it? I have no idea, but I found dozens of them scattered around those clearings. All different shapes, but all made of the same material. I've shown it to a few people over the years, a geology professor at UC Davis, a guy who works at a museum in San Francisco. Nobody can identify the metal or the markings. I handed it back to him. Have you tried to go back? Get more of them? Tommy shook his head emphatically. Hell no. And I'll tell you why. He paused, like he was deciding whether to continue. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before. I was down there for maybe 3 hours, collecting those metal pieces and trying to figure out what I was looking at. The humming was constant, so loud I could feel it in my bones. And then suddenly, it changed. Changed how? It got focused. Like whatever was making the sound had noticed me. The harmonies shifted, and they started to sound almost like language. Not English, not any language I recognized, but definitely communication. And I got the strongest feeling that something was trying to talk to me. I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. What did you do? I got the hell out of there. But as I was climbing back up the ravine, I heard something following me. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. Something big, moving through the trees parallel to my path. I never saw it directly, but I caught glimpses of, I don't know how to describe it, movement that didn't look natural. Too fluid, too coordinated. An animal? Maybe. But if it was unlike any animal I've ever encountered. And I've spent most of my adult life in the wilderness. Tommy stood up and brushed off his jeans. The point is, Jake, there's something down there that's better left alone. I'm not saying don't take your pictures, but be careful. And if you hear that humming again, I'd suggest heading in the opposite direction. I wanted to ask more questions, but Tommy was clearly done with the conversation. He gave me his contact information. He lived in a cabin about 5 miles north of where we were, and told me to get in touch if I needed anything or if I encountered anything unusual. After he left, I sat there for a long time, turning that conversation over in my mind. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a guy who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But there was something about Tommy's manner, the way he told the story, that made me think he was being completely honest about his experiences. And then there was the metal piece. I'd held it in my hands, felt its weight and texture. Whatever it wasn't something you'd find in any hardware store. I spent the rest of that day photographing a different area, but I couldn't stop thinking about the ravine and the humming sound. By evening, I made a decision. I was going to investigate. I know what you're thinking. After everything Tommy had told me, why would I want to get closer to whatever was making that sound? But here's the thing. I've always been curious to a fault. It's what made me a good photographer, but it's also got me into trouble more times than I can count. And despite Tommy's warnings, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Think about it. If there really was something unexplained down in those ravines, something that had been there for possibly hundreds or thousands of years, and I could document it, well, that would be worth a lot more than any magazine assignment. So the next morning, I loaded my pack with extra batteries, water, and emergency supplies, and I headed for the ravine. The humming started before I even reached the edge. It was stronger than it had been the previous days, and Tommy was right. The deeper I went, the more complex it became. What had started as a single low tone gradually resolved into multiple layers of sound, each one weaving in and out of the others in patterns that were almost musical. The ravine was steeper than it had looked from above, and I had to be careful with my footing as I made my way down through the loose rocks and tangled vegetation. The redwoods down here were enormous, some of them probably over 1,000 years old, and they blocked out most of the sky. The light that filtered through was green and diffuse, giving everything an underwater quality. About halfway down, I found the first clearing. It was exactly as Tommy had described, a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, where absolutely nothing grew. The ground was hard-packed earth, darker than the surrounding soil, and in the center was a small pile of those metal pieces. I approached carefully, my camera ready. The humming was much louder here, and I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my boots. I took several shots of the clearing from different angles, then moved closer to examine the metal pieces. There were probably 20 or 30 of them, all different shapes and sizes, but clearly made of the same material as the one Tommy had shown me. Some had the same kind of markings, while others were smooth. I picked up a few of the smaller ones and dropped them into my pack. The humming shifted as I did this, becoming more urgent somehow. The different tones started to separate, and I could swear I heard something that sounded almost like voices. Not words I could understand, but definitely vocal sounds, like a conversation happening just outside the range of human hearing. I left the clearing and continued down the ravine. Over the next hour, I found 4 more clearings, each one larger than the last. The metal pieces in each one were more numerous and more elaborate, with increasingly complex markings. By the time I reached the 5th clearing, some of the pieces were the size of dinner plates. It was in that 5th clearing that I saw the structure. At first, I thought it was just an unusual rock formation, a cluster of dark stone rising from the center of the clearing. But as I got closer, I realized it was too regular, too purposefully shaped. It was roughly pyramidal, about 8 feet tall, made of blocks that fit together with no visible mortar. The surface was covered in the same kind of markings I'd seen on the metal pieces, but much more elaborate. And it was humming. Not just humming, it was the source of all the sounds I'd been hearing. The stone itself was vibrating, producing those complex harmonies that had been echoing through the forest. As I watched, the markings on its surface seemed to pulse and shift, like they were alive. I spent probably an hour photographing the structure from every angle I could think of. The whole time, the humming continued, and I had the persistent feeling that I was being watched. Not by animals, this was something else, something intelligent and patient. It was when I was packing up my camera that I noticed the bones. They were scattered around the base of the structure, mostly hidden by fallen leaves and debris. At first glance, they looked like animal bones, deer, maybe a elk. But as I looked more carefully, I realized some of them were the wrong size and shape. Some of them looked human. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that clearing and never come back. But I'm a photographer and I document what I see, even when what I see scares the hell out of me. I took pictures of the bones. I took pictures of the structure. I took pictures of the clearing and the metal pieces and everything else I could think of. And all the while, that humming continued, getting louder and more complex. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from the far side of the clearing, moving through the trees with a deliberate, measured pace. Not the chaotic crashing of an animal, but the purposeful movement of something that knew exactly where it was going. I grabbed my pack and my camera and started moving toward the edge of the clearing, but the footsteps were getting closer. And they were coming from multiple directions now, not just one set, but several, all converging on the clearing. I found a large redwood at the edge of the circle and pressed myself against it, trying to stay out of sight. The bark was rough against my back, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. For a long moment, everything was silent except for the humming of the stone structure. Then I heard voices, low, conversational, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The sounds were human, but there was something off about them. The cadence was wrong, the intonation strange. I risked a glance around the tree. There were 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. At first glance, they looked like people, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in modern hiking clothes. But as I watched, I realized something was wrong with their movements. They were too fluid, too coordinated, like they were dancing to music I couldn't hear. And their faces were blank. Not emotionless, literally blank. Smooth skin where their features should have been, like unfinished sculptures. They moved into the clearing, still speaking in that strange language, and approached the stone structure. One of them, I think it was the woman, though it was hard to tell without facial features, reached out and touched the surface of the structure. The humming changed immediately, becoming more focused, more intense. The other 2 figures began to move around the perimeter of the clearing, and I realized they were collecting the metal pieces. They worked with efficient, practiced movements, like they'd done this many times before. I wanted to run, but I was afraid they'd hear me. So I stayed pressed against that tree, trying to control my breathing and hoping they wouldn't notice me. That's when I heard my name. Jake. The voice was clear and distinct, speaking perfect English with no trace of accent. Jake Morrison. My blood turned to ice. One of the figures was looking directly at me, though without eyes or any other facial features. I couldn't tell how it knew I was there. Come out, Jake. We know you're there. I considered my options. I could try to run, but they'd probably catch me. I could stay hidden and hope they'd leave, but they clearly knew exactly where I was. Or I could do what they asked and see what happened. Against every survival instinct I had, I stepped out from behind the tree. The three figures turned to face me, and I got a better look at them. They were definitely human-shaped, but their skin had an odd waxy quality, and their clothes looked like they'd been painted on rather than worn. Up close, the absence of facial features was even more disturbing. You have been documenting our activities, the same voice said. It seemed to come from the figure in the middle, though I couldn't see a mouth moving. I'm sorry, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I didn't know. I was just taking pictures for a magazine assignment. We know why you are here, Jake Morrison. Thomas Reeves sent you. That caught me off guard. No, he didn't. He told me to stay away from this place. The figures exchanged glances, at least. They turned their heads toward each other in a way that suggested communication. Thomas Reeves has been watching us for many years. He collects our artifacts. He studies our patterns. He is a curious. What are you? We are the keepers, the voice replied. We maintain the harmony. We preserve the balance. We have done so for longer than your species has walked upright. I looked at the stone structure, still humming its complex melodies. The sound, that's you? The sound calls to those who are ready. Most ignore it. Some, like you, are drawn to investigate. A few, like Thomas Reeves, become obsessed. What happens to the people who go missing? The figures were quiet for a moment. When the voice spoke again, it sounded almost sad. They join us. They become part of the harmony. It is not a cruel fate, Jake Morrison. They find peace. I thought about the bones scattered around the base of the structure. They die. Death is a human concept. We offer transformation. Into what? Into something greater. Something that serves a purpose beyond individual existence. I looked at the three figures standing before me, their blank faces and strange movements, and I thought I understood. You used to be human. We were many things and many times. Human is simply our most recent form. How long have you been here? We have always been here. The forest grows around us. The seasons change. The centuries pass. We remain. The humming from the structure was getting louder, and I could feel it starting to affect me. My thoughts were becoming fuzzy, and there was a strange sense of peace creeping over me. Part of me wanted to just sit down and listen to that sound forever. The harmony calls to you, the voice observed. You feel its pull. I did feel it. It was like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard, complex and soothing at the same time. All I wanted to do was get closer to that stone structure and let the sound wash over me. But another part of me, the part that had kept me alive through years of wilderness photography, was screaming warnings. I forced myself to focus, to resist the pull of that hypnotic humming. I need to go, I said, backing toward the edge of the clearing. You have seen us, Jake Morrison. You have documented our existence. You cannot simply leave. Watch me. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard the voices calling, but they sounded different now. Less human, more like the harmonic tones of the structure itself. The humming grew louder, more insistent, trying to pull me back. I crashed through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, focused on nothing but getting out of that ravine. The strange music followed me, echoing off the canyon walls, but gradually it began to fade as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the rim of the ravine, I was gasping for breath and covered in scratches from the thorny vegetation. But I was alive, and I was still myself. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I drove straight to Tommy's cabin, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I needed to tell someone what I'd seen. He was the only person who might believe me. Tommy's place was a small log structure set back in the trees, with solar panels on the roof and a vegetable garden in the front yard. I pounded on his door, probably sounding like a madman. When he opened the door, he took one look at my face and stepped aside. Jesus, Jake, what happened to you? I told him everything, the clearings, the structure, the figures, the conversation. I showed him the metal pieces I'd collected and the photos on my camera. Tommy listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he went to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, pouring 2 generous glasses. I was afraid something like this might happen, he said, handing me a glass. I should have warned you more explicitly. You did warn me. I just didn't listen. No, I should have told you the whole truth. Tommy sat down across from me, his own glass untouched. Jake, I didn't stumble across those things 7 years ago. I was led to them. What do you mean? Someone wanted me to find them. Someone who knew exactly what I'd do with the information. Tommy's voice was quiet, almost ashamed. I've been working for them, Jake. The people who are interested in what's down in that ravine. My blood ran cold. What people? Government types. Scientists. People who study things that aren't supposed to exist. He finally took a sip of his whiskey. They've been monitoring this area for decades, ever since the first reports of disappearances started showing up in local newspapers. They know about the keepers, and they want to understand them. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought you'd just take your pictures and leave. I didn't think you'd actually go down there. Tommy looked at me with something that might have been regret. I've been reporting on everyone who comes through this area, Jake. Hikers, hunters, researchers. Most of them never encounter anything unusual. But a few get drawn in by the sound. I felt sick. You've been feeding people to those things. No, it's not like that. Most people who hear the humming just dismiss it as some kind of natural phenomenon. They take their pictures or bag their deer and go home. The ones who get recruited, they're the ones who are already looking for something. The ones who are dissatisfied with ordinary life. What about the people who disappear? They don't disappear, Jake. They choose to stay. The keepers offer them something they can't find in the regular world: purpose, belonging, a chance to be part of something eternal. Tommy's voice was getting more defensive. It's not murder, it's transformation. Into those blank-faced things, into something more than human. Something that serves a greater purpose. I stared at him, realizing I was looking at a stranger. You actually believe that? I've seen what they can do, Jake. The harmony they create, the way they maintain balance in these woods. There are things in this world that are bigger than individual human concerns. And the government people you work for, what do they want? Tommy's expression darkened. They want to control it. They think they can study the keepers, learn their secrets, maybe even weaponize their abilities. They don't understand that some things are meant to be left alone. So why do you help them? Because the alternative is worse. If I don't report on what happens here, if I don't help them monitor the situation, they'll send in teams with guns and scientific equipment. They'll try to capture the keepers, dissect them, turn them into lab rats. Tommy finished his whiskey in one gulp. At least this way, the keepers have some control over who encounters them. I felt like I was going to be sick. You're all insane. Maybe. But Jake, you need to understand something. You can't just walk away from this. Not now. You've seen them, talked to them, documented their existence. They know who you are. So what are you saying? I'm saying you have 3 choices. You can go back down there and accept their offer of transformation. You can disappear, leave the state, change your name, start over somewhere else, and never talk about what you've seen. Or, he paused, looking uncomfortable. Or what? Or you can work with us. Help us monitor the situation, report on any unusual activity, make sure things stay balanced. Become a recruiter like you. You mean, it's not recruiting, Jake. It's wildlife management. We make sure the right kind of people encounter the keepers, and we keep the wrong kind of people away. I stood up, my head spinning from the whiskey and the implications of what Tommy was telling me. I need to think about this. Don't think too long. They'll be watching you now, and they're not known for their patience with people who can't make up their minds. I left Tommy's cabin that night with my head full of questions and my camera full of photos I couldn't show to anyone. I drove back to the campground, packed up my gear, and headed home to San Francisco. For the next few weeks, I tried to pretend none of it had happened. I submitted my regular photos to the magazine, wrote up my usual reports about hiking trails and scenic vistas, and tried to get back to my normal routine. But the sound followed me. Not the actual humming. I was hundreds of miles away from those redwood forests, but I could hear it in my memory, complex and beautiful and alien. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard it echoing faintly through my apartment walls. I started having dreams about the clearing, about the stone structure and the blank-faced figures. In the dreams, I was always walking back down into the ravine, drawn by that hypnotic harmony. And every time, I woke up with the feeling that I was supposed to be somewhere else. About a month after I got back, I started noticing things. People following me, not obviously, but there. A woman in a coffee shop who seemed to be reading the same page of her book for 45 minutes while I worked on my laptop. A man in a park who was feeding pigeons with no pigeons around. A couple having an intense conversation on a bench outside my apartment building 3 nights in a row. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling persisted. And then the calls started. The first one came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I answered the phone, but there was no voice on the other end, just that familiar humming, faint but unmistakable. The call lasted exactly 3 minutes, then the line went dead. The calls came every few nights after that, always at random times, always with the same sound. No words, no threats, just the harmony of the stone structure transmitted through fiber optic cables into my apartment. I changed my phone number. The calls continued. I tried to ignore them, but the sound was getting into my head. I found myself humming along sometimes, unconsciously picking up the harmonies. My sleep became fitful and full of dreams about walking through endless forests toward a sound that promised peace and belonging. After 2 months of this, I called Tommy. "I need to talk to you," I said when he answered. "I figured you might. How are you holding up?" "Not well. They're calling me. Every few nights, I get a phone call with that sound. They're trying to call you back. It's what they do with people who've seen them but haven't made a choice yet. Well, I'm making a choice now. I can't live like this. What do you want to do?" "I want to go back. I want to talk to them again." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jake, are you sure? Once you go back, there's no guarantee you'll come out the same person who went in." "I'm not the same person now. I haven't been since I left that clearing." "All right. When do you want to do this?" "Tomorrow. I'll drive up tonight and meet you in the morning." "Jake, if you're thinking about accepting their offer, you should know that it's not reversible. Once you become one of them, that's it. No going back to your old life." "I understand, but I wasn't sure I did understand. Not really. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living with that sound in my head, with the feeling that I was supposed to be somewhere else, doing something else, being something else." I drove back to Mendocino that night, my camera bag in the passenger seat, and my mind full of questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I met Tommy at the same spot where we'd first talked, and together we walked back to the ravine. The humming started before we reached the edge, just as it had before. But this time it sounded different, more welcoming, less alien. Like coming home after a long journey. "You sure about this?" Tommy asked as we started our descent. "No, but I'm sure I can't keep living the way I have been." The clearings were exactly as I'd left them, the metal pieces still scattered around the perfectly circular spaces. But as we got closer to the 5th clearing, I could see that the stone structure had changed. It was taller now, more complex, with additional levels and chambers that hadn't been there before. The 3 figures were waiting for us at the edge of the clearing. They stood in the same positions as before, blank faces turned toward us with an eerie patience. The humming from the stone structure had intensified, now resonating with an energy that seemed to reach into the very core of my being. Tommy stopped a few feet from the clearing and looked at me. "This is where I stop," he said. "I've gone further than most, but I've never stepped inside that ring. That's a choice only you can make." I nodded, feeling both fear and clarity. "Thanks, Tommy, for everything." As I stepped into the clearing, the humming shifted. It welcomed me. The 3 figures moved aside, creating a path to the stone structure. I walked slowly, every step heavy with meaning. At the base of the monument, I paused. The markings along its surface now pulsed in patterns I could almost understand. They weren't just symbols, they were language, music, memory. "Jake Morrison," the central figure said. The voice was no longer hollow. It resonated like it was speaking directly into my thoughts. "Have you made your decision?" I took a breath. "I have. I want to understand. I want to be part of something greater. The moment I said it, everything changed. The structure flared with a cold light that wasn't light. Humming turned to harmony, and time seemed to unravel. My body felt both grounded and completely unmoored. The fear fell away, replaced by something deeper, an awareness and expansion. I saw flashes, Tommy years ago, reaching for the same structure and stopping. I saw others, faces I'd never met, choosing transformation over fear. I saw the keepers as they once were, people, beings, explorers from another time, from another world. Their purpose wasn't domination, it was preservation. Integration. The forest swam in my mind, its roots, its memory, its song. And then I wasn't standing anymore. I was part of the sound. When I opened my eyes, I stood at the edge of the clearing again. But it wasn't me. Not exactly. I had form, but it was borrowed. My old life, my doubts, my identity, they were background noise. I was a note in a larger melody. Tommy watched from outside the ring. He didn't speak. He just nodded, understanding what I had become. Now I'll wait. I'll watch. I hum. I am part of the harmony now. And if you ever hear the sound, deep, ancient, calling from beneath the trees, ask yourself, what will you choose? Because the forest remembers. And it's always listening.